Paul was talking about giving. He was teaching us about how to give correctly and with the right attitude and those types of things. And now he switches gears and is in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 is teaching us self-defense, believe it or not. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 is about self-defense. Our study, our series is called Saints and Sufferers, and that is because suffering, and there are other themes throughout the book, but suffering seems to be a recurring theme. And here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 is no different because Paul was suffering attack or under attack. We'll see that tonight, who was attacking him or what those attacks were, the things that were being leveled against Paul. And so, for those of you that take notes, we've got two main divisions. Again, it's about self-defense, and Paul is going to teach us how to not do that, not carnal, and we'll talk about what carnal is, because that's not something we've talked a lot about in here, so we get this new word or new term, which is exciting, and then by not comparing. So we'll talk about what those mean here in just a moment. But our first section, which is on not carnal, let's find out what's going on here. Verse 1. It begins with the word now, because again, Paul is switching gears. He had been talking about giving. It says, now I, Paul, meaning, okay, we're switching gears here. Now I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you. But I beg you that when I am present, I may not be bold. Now we're going to stop there for just a minute because I want you to understand something. We're talking about defending oneself. And we're Americans, right? We know how to defend ourselves. But that's not what Paul's talking about here. Okay? In fact, he's going to go on to say, hey, we're not defending ourselves physically or with a carnal mind. Again, we'll talk about that. But notice this, as we start to talk about self-defense, notice this in verse 1. Paul, he says, I, Paul, myself, am pleading. I'm pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness. And then he says in verse 2, but I beg you. Now, I want you to think about this. Imagine yourself. Some of you may have taken a self-defense class. But if you can imagine, if you have not taken a self-defense class, would that self-defense class start out with the terms pleading, meekness, gentleness, begging? Those are not terms or words that we would associate with self-defense. Terms that we might associate with self-defense might be, toughness or courage or fearless, fighting. Those are terms that we might associate with self-defense. But see, this is Paul's whole point here in this chapter, is that we as Christians, when we are attacked, and I need to tell you that he's not talking about being physically attacked, although Paul was physically attacked lots of times, many times. What he's talking about or discussing or dealing with here is when your character is attacked. Now, that's a big deal. Fighting today is a big deal. Your feed, your social media feed probably has, you probably come across some fighting videos in there. Everything's caught on camera nowadays. But character assassination or someone attacking your character, that's a big deal also. I just yesterday heard a story from a dad, was telling me a story about his daughter, and that is this very thing, that her character had been attacked. She had been attacked. Her personality, who she was, had been attacked. And so what she did, along with one of her friends, is she took to social media to put out a video to combat that, that attack that had come from this other young lady. That's a common thing. That happens all the time. But is that how you and I, as Christians, are supposed to respond when someone attacks us? I think all of us, or at least most of us, would say, no, that's, we shouldn't do that. So let's find out what Paul is saying here. Now, I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you. He's pleading by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. Now, meekness, does anybody know what meekness is? Learning some new words tonight. Anybody know what meekness is? You're like, you know what, even if I knew what meekness is, no way I'm telling you. Joab, yes, what do you think?
Like a synonym to being humble?
Okay, it is, as a matter of fact. Yes, yes. Okay. I've heard it. The definition that I like best is meekness now I forgot it. It's basically like courage under control. Like you could go on the attack, you could respond and probably do some damage, but instead you keep a humble attitude about it, and you keep that courage or that response, you keep it under control. That's meekness. Moses was known for being a meek man, and that's a good quality. Jesus was known for being a meek man. That's a good quality. Those are individuals who had the ability to do some damage, especially Jesus. And even Moses was a man's man. I mean, he had killed somebody with his own hands and buried him in the sand. So you talk about somebody that's tough. That's tough. But they kept that under control. Paul says, I am pleading with you. Those kids are having so much fun out there, aren't they? They're having so much fun. Paul says, I'm pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. We all know what gentleness is, being gentle. Paul says, we're pleading with you. And right away, as he begins to talk about responding, this self-defense, he's showing us immediately how he's going to handle it with meekness, with the gentleness of Christ. That's what we want to do. And he goes on to say, talking about himself, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you. Now, this is Paul here. We're going to find out what the people were saying about him. But this is one of the things that, when Paul's with you, he's a weakling. But when he's away from you, when he's writing a letter, he's Mr. Big Stuff. He's so tough. He talks tough in his letters. And so Paul uses that here in appealing to the Corinthians, saying, yeah, you remember me, right? I'm lowly or humble when I'm with you. I'm scared or I'm hesitant. But of course, when I'm writing, I'm so tough. Whether Paul is being sarcastic there a little bit or not, I don't know. It sounds like it to me, but anyhow, that's what he's doing there. Verse 2, he says, but I beg you that when I am present, I may not be bold or tough with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. Now, we'll get to that last little part there in just a moment. But Paul is saying, listen, I'm praying that I don't have to show up and be bold with you. I don't want to show up and have to be tough. It's always best, if you've done something wrong at home during the day and your mom says to you, I'm telling your dad, you just wait till he gets home. Are you looking forward to him coming home? No way. No way. You hear his car pulling up into the driveway. All of a sudden you have to go to the bathroom, right? You just try and stand there for an hour, But dad's there, he ain't going nowhere, man. You're not looking forward to that visit. Paul says, listen, he says, hopefully, I don't want to show up. Remember, he's writing a letter to them. He says, I don't want to show up and have a confrontation, okay? He says, I'm begging you that when I am present, I may not be bold with that confidence. So he was actually begging the Corinthians, like, please, get yourselves in line. Correct yourselves. That way when I show up, all it is a good visit. It's just a good visit. Isn't that sweet when you've got good grades and your attitude's been good and dad's coming home? It's a sweet reunion. There's no oh my gosh, there's no fear, okay, I'm going to be in trouble, or okay, I guess I'm going to lose my phone, or he's just going to kill me or whatever. There's none of that. There's no fear. You're just free. You're at peace. And Paul says, please, I'm begging you, get yourselves in line. Correct yourselves, Corinthians, so that when I show up, it doesn't have to be a bad meeting. But he says this in verse 2. He says, that same boldness, let me just read verse 2. But I beg you that when I am present, I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some. He's referencing those people that were attacking him. I'm going to have to be bold with some people, He means the ones that are attacking him, those people think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. Now, the word flesh, I need to just help you understand that a little bit better, because again, it's not something that we've talked much about. But what does it mean, the flesh? Now, when we think of flesh, at least me, I'm assuming you, probably some of you, think of flesh and what? What usually goes along with that? Flesh and bones, flesh and blood, right? You're thinking about your body, skin. And obviously, the word flesh, that's what that means. However, when Paul uses it, when it's in the Bible, the word, not all the time, obviously, but in this case, in this context, when he says, according to the flesh means more than the body, means more than the skin, means more than you as a human being. What it means when he says the flesh is he means a mind that thinks like the world. And I don't just mean the world. What I mean is the sinful world system. When we talk about the flesh, or the way he uses it here, who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh, it means that they were accusing him of doing things not in the Spirit, not doing things spiritually, not depending on the Lord. They were accusing Paul of doing things in a way that was apart from the Lord. That he was just, dreaming up things on his own, and, coming up with these new ideas, and, we don't really need the Lord. Let me just come up with these new ideas and learn ways to control you guys or whatever. So the flesh really means that part of me, not my body, but that part of me that thinks like the sinful world. Okay? So that's what they were accusing Paul of. Not operating in the Spirit, but operating in the flesh. Verse 3, for though we walk in the flesh. Now, what does Paul do here? Paul, he's doing a play on words. For though we walk in the flesh. Wait a minute, you just said that he doesn't walk in the flesh. Which is it? Well, what Paul does now in verse 3 is he uses that flesh in the sense of flesh and blood. He says, yeah, we walk in the flesh and blood. We're really here. We're people, yes, we're here. However, in verse 3, here it is, we do not war according to the flesh. We do not war according to the flesh. Play on words. Yeah, I'm here, flesh and blood. But I do not war. I don't fight according to flesh and blood. That's essentially what he's saying. For the weapons of our warfare, here we are in the middle of verse 4, are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. So while Paul says here, listen, our weapons of warfare are not carnal. Now let's talk about the word carnal for just a minute. Does anybody know what the word carnal means? Anybody? Anybody ever eat? This is how I think of it every time. Anybody ever eat tacos? Come on, preach. Right? We love tacos. What's your favorite kind of meat in tacos? Beef. Somebody said carne asada, right? Beef, carne asada. I usually go for chicken, unless there's fish, but it's just me, okay? I'm okay with beef too, okay? Or maybe you go to get a burrito. Maybe your thing is always like Mexican restaurant, carne asada burrito. Okay, well the word carne, okay? And then we read carnal. So it's that same idea of flesh or meat. Now again, Paul's saying, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. It means the same thing as flesh. It's not of the flesh. Our weapons, the way that we commence war is not with a fleshly mind, a worldly mind. Now, let me explain something to you here. Let me tell you what's going on. Paul has been accused of not being led by the Spirit. But he's been accused of doing things in the flesh or with a carnal mind or with a worldly mind. We see that today. It happens all over the place. And even sadly, it even happens in churches. where you have tactics that some churches will use in order to fill the church up. And we're giving away $20 gift cards this week. Everybody come to church. That sounds like a fun thing or a nice thing or a sweet thing, but what it is it's a tactic to try and get more people to come in. What we want to do, you and I, whenever we're involved in a Bible study or a church, something like this, we want to make the teaching of God's Word the main thing. And the people that show up, they show up to hear the Word of God taught, not to get something for free. If you get people to come by giving things out, guess what? In order for them to stay, you got to keep giving things out. But God's way of doing, so that would be carnal. That would be operating in the flesh, is coming up with some ploy, some tactic to try and gain followers, get people. But Paul, so Paul was being accused of those types of things. Paul says we don't work that way. He says, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. I love this. If you just read through it, you really don't notice. But look, here's what Paul's saying in verse 4. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God. In other words, Paul says, we do have weapons of warfare. We do. They're just not carnal. The weapons of warfare that we have are godly, but mighty in God. That's the idea there. They're godly. The weapons that Paul used when he was attacked were godly weapons, spiritual weapons, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. In other words, somebody attacks my character, okay? Say tomorrow I go to school or whatever, or, somebody says something about me. They spread rumors and start gossiping about me. And so I decide, you know what? I'm going to get them back. I'm going to go get on my social media, man. I'm just going to put them on blast right now. That would be operating in the flesh. That would be using carnal weapons of warfare. That's not the way that Christ would operate. That's not the way that Paul was trying to operate. So we ought not operate that way either. What we want to do is we want to operate in a godly way. Well, what's the godly way? Well, I'm glad that you asked. Because he says, but mighty, our weapons of warfare are mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. He goes on to mention some others. Verse 5, casting down arguments. Okay? So responding in a godly manner will cast down arguments. If somebody is spreading a rumor about me and I respond with love or with gentleness or meekness, what is that doing? It's showing everyone that was listening to that rumor about me, that gossip, that lie, that, hey, this person's not really like that. This other person is just spreading lies. They're obviously lies, because look how this person responded. They're responding in love. They're responding in meekness, with gentleness. They're responding in a godly way. So obviously what was being said about them is not true. So it casts down arguments. Verse 5, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Okay, there's another one. So Paul's weapons of warfare were godly. They brought down strongholds. They would cast down or throw down arguments. But they would also throw down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. So Paul didn't have to go out fighting everybody every time they said something wrong about God, and storming in places and, throwing people. He didn't have to do that. What he did was he responded in a godly manner, in a godly way. And what that would do is that it would reveal that Paul was the genuine article. He's the real deal. He's the real deal. See, that's going to cause us to shine for Christ. When you and I, somebody attacks us, says something about us, and we respond in a godly manner, what that does is it shows everyone that, hey, that guy, that girl, they definitely are a Christian. they definitely are following Jesus, because look how they're responding. They're not responding with hatred or with anger. They're responding with gentleness, with meekness. They, man, if they decided to, they could fight that other person, but they don't. They keep that under control. Meekness. He goes on to describe, he's not done yet, verse 5, casting down arguments, every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. This is a verse that I've shared with many of you when you've come to me and said, hey, I'm struggling with this and I have these thoughts and, what should I do? Well, what you need to do is you need to bring every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And spiritual weapons of warfare allow me and cause me to do that. Now, I want to say something here before we move on. Bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ implies to you and me that the thoughts that I'm having can be controlled. Because I can take those thoughts and bring them to Christ. It's been described this way. I love this description. I don't know, you might think it's so corny, but who cares? I care, but I care what you think, but not in this case. A bird, you cannot stop a bird from landing on your head. However, you can stop it from making a nest on your head. So the bird might stop. What do you got to do? Shoo that thing away, right? If a bird landed on your head, what would you do? You would scream, run, yell, right? But the point is this. The point is that you can't stop thoughts from coming into your mind. I know. Listen, the thoughts, sometimes you just have crazy thoughts. Like, where did that come from? However, according to this, we have some control over those thoughts. Once they come into my mind, what do I do with it? Do I allow that thought to come into my mind? I know it's a bad thought, but do I then allow it to make its nest, to set up a home in my mind? Do I entertain that thought and I just roll with it? Listen, let me explain something. Let me share something with you, because I know none of you have ever done this, okay? But I've done it. Where I know that tomorrow I've got to have a conversation, an uncomfortable, awkward conversation with somebody. And within a matter of moments, as I'm thinking about that conversation, and I'm thinking, okay, how is this conversation going to go tomorrow? Within a matter of moments, before I realize it, in my mind, me and that other individual that we were having a conversation, we're now fighting. And it's turned into this super big, huge deal, and now we're fighting, and now we got into a physical fight, a physical altercation, and in my mind, man, it's just, this is what's happening, and it's blowing up, and it's getting so big, and it's horrible. I've done that in my mind, where I get a thought, and then I just allow that thought to stay there, and then it just explodes. None of you have ever done that, right? You never overthink things, right? You never go crazy thinking, and then the next day you actually have the conversation and you go, oh, that wasn't so bad, right? You're surprised. That's happened to me so many times over the years. So I'm trying to learn not to, when the thoughts come in and I'm imagining, okay, how's this conversation going to go or whatever, I try to keep myself from allowing that thought to take off. What am I doing? I'm trying to take every thought captive. What does he say here? Where did I go? Lost my place, sorry. Bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. Those godly weapons of warfare, the spiritual weapons of warfare, are going to allow me, okay, if I'm calling on the Lord for help, the spiritual weapons are going to, the godly power, the godly weapons are going to allow me to bring those thoughts into captivity to the obedience of Christ. I need to do that, right? If I'm thinking carnally or in the flesh, then what am I doing with those thoughts? Man, I'm letting them just grow and fester and get all ugly inside my mind. And then I go to have this conversation with the person the next day, and I'm already, all hyped up and like ready to fight. no good. No good. Verse 6, he's not done yet. The weapons of warfare that he uses, the godly weapons. He says, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. What's he talking about there in verse 6? He's telling the Corinthians that, listen, your obedience will be punished when your obedience is fulfilled. In other words, these things are going to be fixed when you're obedient. Be obedient, he's telling them. Now, the second thing that he tells them is just that one little subpoint is self-defense. He says, we're not comparing ourselves here. Verse 7, do you look at things according to the outward appearance? In other words, do you judge things according to how they look? Of course we do. We do that all the time. If anyone is convinced in himself that he is Christ's, let him again consider this in himself, that just as he is Christ, even so we are Christ. What does he mean there? He says, listen, there are people who are doubting. They go, oh, Paul. And Paul's working toward, here in this section, toward his outward appearance, okay? There were people who were saying, well, look at Paul. He can't possibly belong to Christ. Look how ugly he is. No joke. People were saying that, okay? We'll see it here in just a moment. Look at him, okay? But Paul says, look, we've got imperfections, just like you've got imperfections. And you belong to Christ with your imperfections. We belong to Christ with our imperfections also. Verse 8, for even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification and not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed. He says, look, I'm going to brag sometimes. I'm going to boast. Not about himself, not about the things that he's accomplished, but about the people. We've seen it before in Corinthians. I don't know if you were here for it or not, but Paul has bragged about the Corinthians before and said, man, look at these people. They're giving people. Those are the types of things that Paul would boast about. Verse 9, lest or unless I seem to terrify you by my letters. For his letters in verse 10, they say. Okay, here we go. Now, Paul is quoting some of these attacks that had been leveled at him. Here's some of the things that people had said about Paul. For his letters are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. In other words, this guy, when he writes letters, he sounds so tough. But then when he's face to face, look at him. There are some accounts of Paul from outside of the Bible. Here's one from about the year 200. A man, it described him as a man of small stature with a bald head and crooked legs. A lot of people think that the crooked legs means that he was bow-legged. Okay? You know, like his legs were kind of like rounded. A man of small stature with a bald head and crooked legs, in a good state of body. In other words, at that time, he still seemed to be healthy, with eyebrows meeting and nose somewhat hooked. So according to that account, and we don't have any pictures of him, we don't know exactly what he looked like, and this could be totally off. But most scholars believe that this was accurate. According to this, he was a short man, bald, crooked legs. He was in okay health at that time, but with a unibrow and a hooked nose. So you can imagine, right? You can imagine. They probably would have looked at it like he writes a letter. We read his letters. We're studying his letters. And your church gets a letter and you go, oh man, this is incredible. We got a letter from Paul. And then you hear he's going to visit and you're so excited. And hey, Paul, here comes Paul. Paul's actually coming. And you're like, where's he at? You can't see him. He's too short. And then you're like, that little bald man? Really? With his hooked nose or, with his unibrow? And then later on in life, it's believed that he had bad eyesight, that he had some kind of trouble with his eyes. And so he's, it's like, who's this? Who's this guy? But what Paul is pointing out here is people were attacking his outward looks. Like I told you a minute ago, Paul, his letters are so tough, but man, the guy's ugly. He can't possibly be from the Lord. you and I have got to be careful, right? You got to be careful. Man, to see some pastors or Bible teachers, online or, wherever, man, some of these guys or some of these ladies, man, they look like models, right? Like, man, like, well, you just look like a model. Like, everything about you is perfect. Like, what, you're teaching the word and you just, just the outward beauty. But we have to be careful to look beyond. Outward beauty is fine. There's nothing wrong with outward beauty. But we have to make sure that we're listening to the content, listening to what the individual has to say, and not just looking with our eyes and making a judgment like, oh, this person obviously is from God. Look how beautiful he is, We can't do that. But people were accusing Paul of being, that he wasn't the genuine article because, well, he writes real tough in his letters, but look at him. Oh my gosh, the man is so short, bald, unibrow, bad eyes or whatever. Let such a person, in verse 11, those that were saying these things, let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters, when we are absent, such we will also be indeed when we are present. And it's actually like a threat from Paul. Paul says, okay. They're saying that I'm talking big in my letters. Paul says, okay, we'll just let that person know that when we show up, we're going to be the same way in person that we were when we were in our letters. So if that person is accusing us of just being bold in our letters when we show up, that person and us, they're going to have a problem. We're going to have a problem. That's what Paul is saying there. Verse 12, for we dare not class ourselves. And here's the comparison part, not comparing. For we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves. But they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. He says, we're not comparing ourselves with anyone. And there are people who compare themselves, their little club, they only compare themselves with themselves. It's not wise. We, however, verse 13, we will not boast beyond measure. We'll boast, but only with what God has given us, but within the limits of the sphere which God appointed us, a sphere which especially includes you. So Paul says we're only boasting about what God has, what he's given us, where we're working. For we are not overextending ourselves, as though our authority did not extend to you. For it was to you that we came with the gospel of Christ. In other words, Paul says, listen, we're going to continue to boast about you guys, Corinthians. And listen, I understand what Paul's saying. I brag about you guys, Fusion. When I'm talking with somebody, some of my other friends that are in ministry that aren't here or whatever, even people that are at the church. It's like, yeah, I get to be with the high school. Or man, this is a good group, or what, they show up and they're ready to study or whatever. I brag, I boast about you guys. Now, I can't brag about anything else. This is where I'm at. This is where God has me. But I understand what Paul's saying here. That's what Paul's saying. We're going to continue to boast, about the sphere that God had given them. Verse 15, not boasting of things beyond measure. That is, we're not boasting about things that other people did, but having hope that as your faith is increased, we shall be greatly enlarged by you in our sphere. In other words, we just want for you guys to grow. We want you to be greatly enlarged. We want you for your relationship with the Lord to continue to grow, and then that will expand our sphere. Paul is saying to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's sphere of accomplishment. A sphere of accomplishment. In other words, we're bragging about you guys, and we're just, we want for you guys to grow, and then you guys go out and continue preaching the gospel, and that circle begins or continues to grow. Verse 17, he quotes Jeremiah 9:24, but he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. And finally, in verse 18, what Paul says here is, listen, he was not comparing himself with anybody. Look at verse 18, how he finishes. For not he who commends himself is approved, but whom the Lord commends. So Paul says there, he finishes up this section by saying, listen, in self-defense, we're not doing it carnally, and we're not doing it by comparison to anybody. He says, all we want to do, verse 18, we just want to be commended by the Lord. It's not about the person that makes him or herself bigger and, they make themselves look great. That doesn't matter. But who does the Lord command? Who does the Lord lift up? So Paul is there. He closes out this chapter, at least this section, by just saying, listen, all we're doing is we're just trying to please the Lord, and we're going to let the Lord, handle all of that other stuff. All we're going to do is we're just going to let the Lord commend us or approve of